Hoffa and the mob, it seems, were straining for ammunition against the Kennedys. Today, one of those who tangled with Kennedy at the hearings lives in quiet retirement in Palm Springs. He took some interest in the political connections of Marilyn Monroe. He's Max Bloch, former president of the Meat Cutters Union, then known as Max the Butcher. He says he and Jimmy Hoffa heard of meetings between Marilyn Monroe and Robert Kennedy years before. They took place at the Desert Inn, Las Vegas, the very heart of mob territory. The date, Bloch claims, was 1957. His informant, the manager of the hotel, Wilbur Clark.
He told me that he checks him in every few weeks for a couple of days. Up on the 7th floor, I think he mentioned to me, a suite of rooms. And that's it. And finally, one day, I'm sitting with him, and Bobby's passing by, and I said, "Hello, Wilbur." I said, "Hello, Bobby." And my friend Max Bloch. "Oh," he said, "I know Bloch from New York." And he kept going. So I said, "Where is he running?" He says he's going to see Marilyn upstairs.
True or not, Jimmy Hoffa was certainly determined to acquire damaging evidence against the Kennedys. That is, evidence of sexual indiscretion. Chuck O'Brien, Hoffa's foster son and once trusted aide, insists he did hear about a Marilyn Monroe-Robert Kennedy connection starting in the late 50s.
There's no question about other people knowing about it. That type of information that would get back to people that were in the midst of trying to defend themselves from Bobby Kennedy.
I tend to have the impression left, has been stated publicly, that I'm controlled by gangsters. I am not controlled by it.
In the climate of the times, proof of moral transgression by the upright Robert Kennedy might indeed have been damaging. Did Jimmy Hoffa have that information?
Yeah, I think he did. In fact, I know he did. You know, he had knowledge of it.
When I mentioned to Jimmy about Bobby and Marilyn Monroe, this is what he answered me. So I know he's been screwing around with her for a long time.
Did you say that SOB, I'll break his back?
Not concerning him, as far as I know of.
Well, who did you make it about?
I don't know. I may have been discussing somebody in a figure of speech.
Well, who did you make the statement? Whose back were you going to break?
I don't even remember it.
Well, whose back were you going to break, Mr. Hoffa?
They give his speech. I don't even know who I was talking about, and I don't know what you're talking about.
Hoffa wanted to neutralize Kennedy. He had a vendetta for him, and Kennedy had a vendetta for Hoffa.
No question about Hoffa, and don't you say that either. Don't you say that I'm a communist, or even affiliated with one. You said that enough around this country.
He hated him, of course. He ruined him. He the kind of him he got killed.
I think he felt if Bobby passed away, that they have to hire pallbearers to put him in the ground, you know.
He suggested that they should sit down at the head of the restaurant and talk it over, to which Feldman replied, "Listen, there is only one solution. It's to break his neck for him."
An absolute spoiled brat, a man who never had to work, a man who had no principle, a man who would do anything to get himself a headline or a headline for his brother, and use the Teamsters as a stepping stone to get his brother elected and he'd become Attorney General. I had no respect for him then. I have no respect for his memory now.
Publicly, Hoffa denied ordering the bugging of Marilyn Monroe, but in summer 1961, he did summon Private Detective Fred Otash to a meeting in Florida. The topic would be Hoffa's campaign against the Kennedys. Also present was wiretapper Bernie Spindell, whose fame rested on his ability to eavesdrop on anybody or anything.
What Hoffa wanted was me to assist Bernie Spindell in developing a derogatory profile on Jack and Bobby Kennedy and their relationships with Marilyn Monroe, mainly, and any other women that might come into focus. And the strategy that was agreed upon was to use electronic devices. And the most logical place to set those devices was Peter Lawford's home in Malibu.
November 1961, Jack Kennedy was back in Los Angeles talking about political extremism.
Men who are unwilling to face up to the danger from without are convinced that the real danger is from within. They look suspiciously at their neighbors and their leaders. They call for a man on horseback.
According to the wiretappers, their eavesdropping operation was now working efficiently at the Lawford Beach House, where they claimed the president was still having occasional meetings with Marilyn Monroe. Technician John Danoff, stationed in a car nearby, taping signals from microphones hidden in the house, asked his boss, Fred Otash, whether it was really such a good idea to eavesdrop on the Kennedy brothers.
What he said to me was, what you don't know won't hurt you. And I said, well, I can get myself killed that way. And he so-called replied that what you don't know won't hurt you. You're getting paid, so just do your job and shut your mouth, which I did.
Otash confirms he did receive tapes of conversations inside the house.
Some with Jack Kennedy, some with Bobby Kennedy, some with Monroe, some with other people. And conversations on the phone as to arrangements and meetings that were going to be rendezvous with Jack Kennedy and Monroe, Jack Kennedy and other people, Bobby Kennedy and Monroe, and Bobby Kennedy and other people.
Did Jimmy Hoffa tell you that he actually did have the tapes in his safe?
Yeah, I knew he had them. Yeah, I knew he had the tapes. We had other tapes, too.
Do you think Jimmy Hoffa would have been prepared to have used that information if he'd had to against Bobby Kennedy?
I think so. I think so. He went too deep with him.
Surprisingly, Marilyn herself had already received some direct attention from the mafia. In late 1959, tailed by two agents from the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office, she'd left a restaurant on Sunset Boulevard escorted by a young Italian with mob connections. The DA's men followed them over Coldwater Canyon, concerned that the mob's purpose might be to compromise or extort money from Marilyn. Later, it turned out that Marilyn had another, more important mob contact. Johnny Rosselli, the Chicago mob's man in Hollywood, knew her socially and the gossip about her. His boss was Sam Giancana, the head of the most powerful mafia family in the United States, and a man viciously opposed to the Kennedy brothers. This casino complex on the Rocky Heights over Lake Tahoe was one of the places where the mob kept watch on Marilyn Monroe. The Calneva Lodge, on the state line between California and Nevada, was to acquire somber significance in the last months of Marilyn's life. Advertised as a heaven in the high Sierras, it proved irresistibly attractive to entertainers, high rollers from Hollywood and Las Vegas, and gangsters. Frank Sinatra, who was buying the Calneva, had invited Marilyn Monroe and the cast of the Misfits to see him perform. Frank Sinatra also gave her a poodle. She named it Math. Later, Marilyn was to take an overdose of drugs at the Calneva and would spend the last weekend of her life here, distraught and apparently suicidal. But that was still 2 years away.
It was the in-place at Lake Tahoe, and the in-place of the gambling casinos, because that's where the Klan hung out. That was Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis, Peter Lawford, Joey Bishop, all the top gamblers from all over the world. The Calneva was the in-place.
Amongst them was Sam Giancana, Mo to his friends, boss of the Chicago crime syndicate, and a prime target in the Kennedys' war on organized crime.
He was always dressed beautifully. Very high-class looking gentleman, you know.
Would you tell us whether if you have opposition from anybody that you dispose of them by having them stuffed in a trunk? Is that what you do, Mr. Giancana?
Decline to answer because I honestly believe my answer might tend to
Will
incriminate.
you tell us anything about any of your operations, or you just giggle every time I ask you a question?
Decline to answer because I honestly believe my answer might tend to incriminate me.
I thought only little girls giggled, Mr. Giancana.
At O'Hare Airport, Chicago, in July 1961, Giancana and his girlfriend, Phyllis McGuire, were cornered by FBI agents. McGuire was a singer, a member of the McGuire sisters, and a friend of Marilyn Monroe. The FBI plan was to interview her about her relationship with the mafia boss, leaving Giancana to cool his heels in the airport terminal. The incident provoked an extraordinary outburst.
He asked me if I was going to make a report of my confrontation with him to my boss. And I said, my boss? Who's my boss? He said, J. Edgar Hoover. And I said, well, certainly I'm going to make a report of this. And he said, screw J. Edgar Hoover. And I said, all right, I'll tell him that. And then he said, are you going to make a report to your super boss? And I said, well, who would that be, my super boss? He said, Robert Kennedy. And I said, well, I'm sure he'll get a copy of that. He said, screw Robert Kennedy. He then said, what about your super boss? Are you going to make a report to him? And I said, who's my super boss? He said, John Kennedy, the President of the United States. And I said, well, he might get a copy, but on the other hand, I don't think John Kennedy is interested in Sam Giancana. He said, Romer, he said, you'll be surprised. He said, I know a hell of a lot of things about the Kennedy family, and Phyllis McGuire knows a hell of a lot of things about the Kennedy family, and one of these days, Romer, we're going to tell that story.
So did Giancana have something on the Kennedys? Certainly he shared a girlfriend with the president, one Judy Exner. FBI files reveal that he also talked of bugging the Attorney General. Today, Phyllis McGuire says she knew Marilyn quite well. She knew about her relationships with Jack and Robert Kennedy, who she says Marilyn wanted to marry. What Phyllis McGuire knew, Sam Giancana, the mafia boss of bosses, certainly knew too.
What happened to flipping bubblegum cards? Or breaking a bottle of milk and being afraid to go home?
In September 1961, Los Angeles radio broadcaster Tom Clay began to get calls from a woman who said she was Marilyn Monroe.
Whatever happened to Good Night, Stars, I Love You? Or whatever happened to Starlight, Star Bright, First Star I See Tonight? Whatever happened to Jack Armstrong, the all-American boy?
Much moved by his talk of childhood, his own children, marriage, time past, the woman called Clay repeatedly. She seemed to be lonely.
As the aging hand of time runs her fingers through my hair, all I can think of is, whatever happened to Now I Lay Me Down to Sleep? I pray the Lord my soul to keep.
Finally, Clay arranged to meet the woman. It was indeed Marilyn Monroe.
I said, geez, I've never imagined that anybody as famous as you could be bored or lonely. And she said, have you ever been in one room and felt loneliness? And I said, yeah. I said, I have. She said, multiply mine by 40 rooms, and then you'll have some idea as to how lonely I am. She seemed like a little girl, lost. Just like everything had passed her by.
By now, Marilyn's psychiatrist was writing of her depressive reactions, her inclination to suicide. Several years before, she'd emerged from a psychiatric clinic in New York after being treated for an undisclosed illness. Not schizophrenia, said a doctor, but she was psychiatrically disconnected. Marilyn complained that doctors and nurses had come to gawp at her, her arms bound, a curiosity piece. From inside she wrote, I'm locked up with all these poor, nutty people. I'm sure to end up a nut if I stay in this nightmare. Please help me.
She wrote little verses that she'd occasionally mail to me, asked me if she had any talent as a great poet. And I would read them and comment on them. And one of the little things she wrote, just 3 lines. Help, 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 I feel life coming closer when all I want to do is die.
Marilyn's friends thought her film career was also showing signs of faltering. Back in Hollywood from the East Coast, at the start of what would be the last year of her life, she bought a small house quite unlike the ostentatious mansions of Beverly Hills. Under the door, an inscription read in Latin, Cursum Perficio, I'm completing my journey.
This was the last act for Marilyn. Maybe she sensed it because she'd come back to Hollywood defeated. You know, it's that kind of panic that happens when you feel that somebody has lost its power.
Marilyn was doing costume tests for the last film she would ever make, Something's Got to Give. Before filming began, the producer had personally rescued her from an overdose of barbiturates. She was ill and paranoid, he said. Filming began as it ended disastrously.
She was in a state of controlled desperation, as though she were almost beyond help. And yet, there she was, going through the daily routines of making rounds, seeing friends, and all the time she was, I think, sliding off.